The Zenithar Research Station orbited a dying star in the Kepler 442 system, which was poetic in a way that absolutely nobody aboard appreciated. Here, suspended in the void like a monument to interspecies cooperation, or more accurately, like a monument to interspecies tolerating each other while secretly thinking everyone else was an idiot, the brightest minds of 17 different civilizations gathered to push the boundaries of theoretical physics. And by boundaries, we mean the boundaries of how much condescension one species could heap upon another before someone started a diplomatic incident. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, a rotating wheel 3 kilometers in diameter with sections devoted to different gravitational preferences, atmospheric compositions, and temperature ranges. The VRIN needed their sulfur-rich atmosphere at 340 Kelvin. The KEFRI required precise 1.3 gravity and couldn't function properly without it. The Morgathi needed darkness and cold that would make a cryogenic chamber seem tropical. And the humans? Well, the humans just needed oxygen and a coffee machine, which apparently made them the cosmic equivalent of houseplants. Simple, undemanding, not particularly impressive. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Collective for exactly 14 standard years, which in galactic terms was roughly equivalent to showing up to a 5,000-year-old party 15 minutes ago, and expecting people to care about your opinion on the music. The general consensus among the elder species was that humans were enthusiastic, loud, disturbingly fragile, and possessed of a peculiar tendency to become emotionally attached to absolutely everything, including their machinery, their clothing, and in one documented case, a small robot designed to vacuum floors. The human section of the station was regarded much the way one might regard a petting zoo attached to a university. Cute, occasionally entertaining, not somewhere you'd go for serious intellectual discourse. Dr. Reyna Caldwell had heard all the jokes. She'd heard them in the corridors, in the commissary, in the labs where she worked. She'd heard them in 6 different languages and 3 forms of telepathic projection, which was particularly annoying because, at least with spoken insults, you could pretend you hadn't heard them. When a VRIN projected the mental image of you as a soft, squishy child playing with blocks while the adults did real work, there was no plausible deniability available. She was 32 years old, possessed of 3 doctorates in fields that most humans found incomprehensible, and had published 17 papers on gravitational field theory that had been cited exactly 4 times, 3 of which were by herself and 1 by her former professor, who felt sorry for her. She stood at 5 feet 4 inches, wore glasses she didn't technically need but liked anyway because they made her feel more focused, and had been on Zenithar Station for 8 months without making a single friend. Not that she was trying particularly hard. Hard to make friends when your colleagues treat you like an enthusiastic golden retriever who somehow wandered into a surgical theater. Reyna spent her days in Lab 7, which was technically the theoretical gravitational applications wing, but which everyone called the gravity playground because it sounded less pretentious. Her workstation was in the corner, naturally, tucked behind a structural support column where she could be easily forgotten. Her alien colleagues occupied the prime real estate near the windows with the spectacular view of the dying star, which cast everything in a perpetual amber twilight that they found inspiring and which gave Reyna mild headaches. The head of the department was Zalvarath, a KEFRI who stood nearly 8 feet tall on 4 digitigrade legs, possessed 6 upper limbs of varying sizes, and had a chitinous exoskeleton that shimmered with colors that human eyes couldn't quite process properly. He held 4 degrees from the University of Keperos Prime, had won the Tannhauser Prize for theoretical physics twice, and had an ego that could have its own gravitational field. His primary assistants were Soriath, a VRIN whose serpentine body and mathematical genius were equally intimidating, and Thex, a Morgathi who resembled an enormous moth, if moths were 7 feet tall and condescending. Together, they formed what Reyna privately called the triumvirate of insufferable brilliance. They were, admittedly, brilliant. Reyna could acknowledge that. Zalvarath's work on quantum gravitational matrices had revolutionized interstellar navigation. Soriath had cracked problems in n-dimensional field theory that had stumped researchers for generations, Thex had developed the mathematical framework that made artificial gravity possible without planet-sized masses. They were also absolutely convinced that human mathematics was the equivalent of counting on one's fingers. The human has submitted another report, Soriath announced one morning, her voice a sibilant hiss that the translation implants rendered as vaguely amused contempt. She held up a datapad as though it contained something distasteful. She believes she has found an error in our field calculations. Zal Vorath didn't even look up from his work. Two of his middle arms continued manipulating holographic equations, while his primary arms gestured dismissively. An error, how delightful. I suppose she used one of those charming human calculators. Perhaps she consulted a abacus? Thex's wings fluttered, which was Morgathi laughter. What is the nature of this error? Did we forget to carry a one? She claims, Soriath said, now examining the datapad with theatrical curiosity, that our resonance dampening calculations contain a fundamental phase shift error that will create cascading harmonics in the gravitational field matrix. She has included 17 pages of supporting mathematics and what appears to be a simulation she ran on her personal terminal. 17 pages, Zal Vorath repeated. How thorough, how very human. Throw more information at a problem, as if quantity compensates for quality. Forward it to the archive. Perhaps someone will find it amusing in a century or two when they research the early fumbling of primitive species. From her corner, Reyna's jaw tightened. She didn't say anything. She'd learned months ago that saying something just made it worse. They'd pat her on the head, metaphorically speaking, and tell her to keep trying, that her enthusiasm was adorable even if her understanding was limited. The project they were working on was officially called the Cascade Generator Initiative, but everyone called it the Big One because Zal Vorath liked dramatic names and nobody wanted to argue with him. The concept was elegant in theory. Create a controlled gravitational cascade that could fold spacetime in a specific pattern, allowing for instantaneous travel across distances that would normally take centuries, even at faster than light speeds. If it worked, it would change everything. Transportation, commerce, exploration, all of it would be revolutionized. The mathematics were hideously complex. The engineering was worse. They'd been working on it for 3 standard years, and they were finally ready for a full-scale test. The device itself sat in Chamber 1, a reinforced testing arena that could theoretically contain a small nuclear explosion. It looked like a sculpture designed by someone who'd had a fever dream about geometry, all impossible angles and surfaces that hurt to look at directly. Reyna had been reviewing the calculations for months. She'd noticed the problem almost immediately, that subtle phase shift error buried in the resonance dampening equations. It was the kind of mistake that wouldn't show up in small-scale tests, because the error propagated exponentially with the size of the gravitational field. In a small field, it was negligible. In a field the size they were planning to generate, it would be catastrophic. She'd tried to tell them, God, she'd tried. First, she'd sent polite emails with her concerns and supporting data. Those were ignored. Then she'd requested a meeting with Zal Vorath directly. He'd agreed to see her for exactly 4 minutes, during which he'd glanced at her work, made a comment about human pattern recognition being particularly good at seeing problems that didn't exist, and dismissed her. She'd tried going to Soriath, who'd been slightly less dismissive but ultimately condescending, suggesting that Reyna was confusing cause and effect in her analysis. Thex had actually been the worst. He'd looked at her mathematics, acknowledged that it was interesting, and then explained, in the tone one might use with a child, that while her approach was creative, it was based on human mathematical frameworks that were less sophisticated than the systems the elder races used. Perhaps if she studied Khepri tensor calculus for a few decades, she'd understand why her concerns were unfounded. So, she'd done what any reasonable person would do when everyone around them was confidently marching toward disaster, while ignoring all warnings. She'd started building her own solution. Her quarters were small, even by human standards. She'd converted most of the living space into a makeshift laboratory. Her bed was buried under datapads and component parts. Her small fabricator, which was supposed to be used for printing meal containers and utensils, had been running constantly for 3 months, printing specialized components for a device she designed. It was technically against regulations to build unauthorized equipment. It was also technically against regulations to knowingly operate a gravitational field generator with a fundamental flaw in its design that would tear a space station apart. But apparently, nobody was worried about that. The device sat on her desk, about the size of a large briefcase, filled with components that she'd had to design from scratch because nothing in the station's inventory could do what she needed. It was a gravitational field harmonizer, designed to detect and counteract the exact type of cascading resonance error she'd identified. It would work. She'd tested it in simulation roughly 3,000 times. Whether anyone would let her use it was another question entirely. The day of the demonstration arrived with all the fanfare of a major historical event. The station commander had actually shown up, a 4-armed Quellan named Administrator Vorsh, who rarely left his administrative section. There were representatives from 6 different governments, a handful of journalists, and most of the station's senior research staff. They crowded into the observation gallery overlooking Chamber 1, where the cascade generator sat waiting like a technological altar. Reyna stood at the back of the gallery, holding her device in a plain carrying case, watching Zalvorath hold court. He was explaining the theoretical underpinnings of the technology with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his entire life. Soriath and Thex flanked him, occasionally adding details, basking in reflected glory. "The beauty of our approach," Zalvorath was saying, his voice resonating through the gallery with the kind of practiced authority that came from years of being listened to, "is that we have eliminated all possible sources of field instability. The harmonic resonance is perfectly calibrated. The dampening fields are mathematically flawless. We have run millions of simulations, and every single one confirms our calculations." Reyna's hand tightened on the handle of her case. She'd run millions of simulations too. They'd all shown the same thing: catastrophic failure within 90 seconds of full activation. She should have stayed in her quarters. She should have let them learn their lesson the hard way. But the problem with catastrophic failure in a gravitational field generator was that everyone would die, including her, and she'd spent too many years getting her doctorates to die because a bunch of arrogant aliens wouldn't check their math. She pushed through the crowd towards Zalvorath. It wasn't easy. The gallery was packed, and most of the attendees were significantly larger than her. A Quellan administrator gave her an annoyed look as she squeezed past. A Vryn researcher made a hissing sound of displeasure. "Excuse me," she said, projecting her voice as much as she could. "Excuse me, I need to speak with Dr. Zalvorath." Several heads turned. Zalvorath's multiple eyes focused on her with the kind of attention one might give to a persistent insect. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, his tone managing to convey both recognition and dismissal. "How delightful that you've joined us for this historic moment. I trust you'll learn a great deal from observing proper scientific methodology." There were a few chuckles from the crowd. Reyna felt her face flush, but she pressed forward. "You can't activate the generator. There's a fundamental error in the phase calculations. I've been trying to tell you for months. If you turn that thing on, the resonance harmonics will create a cascading gravitational field that will tear the station apart." The chuckles turned into full laughter. Even Administrator Vorsh was smiling, all 4 arms crossed in a posture of amused tolerance. "Dr. Caldwell," Zalvorath said, and now his tone had shifted from dismissive to actively patronizing, "I appreciate your concern. Truly, I do. Your species' capacity for worry is quite remarkable. But I assure you, we have checked our calculations extensively. The mathematics are sound. Perhaps, and I mean this with all respect, the error is in your understanding, rather than our design." "I've run 3,000 simulations," Reyna said, hearing the desperation creeping into her voice and hating it. "I've checked the math, 17 different ways. I even built a scale model. The error is in the phase shift resonance dampening. You're using a linear compensation model when the field propagation is exponential. It works fine at small scales, but at full power, the error compounds every microsecond until the field destabilizes." Soriath slithered forward slightly. "Dr. Caldwell, With all due respect to your enthusiasm, you are working with human mathematical frameworks. The tensor calculus we employ is several orders of magnitude more sophisticated. It is possible, even likely, that what appears to you as an error is simply a limitation of your analytical tools. I used your tensor calculus, Reyna shot back. I learned it specifically to check your work. The error is still there. It doesn't matter what mathematical language you use to describe reality. Reality doesn't care about your credentials. Enough, Zalvorath said, his voice sharp now. This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. You have submitted your concerns through proper channels, they have been reviewed and found wanting, and we are proceeding with the demonstration. If you cannot maintain professional decorum, I will have to ask you to leave. People are going to die, Reyna said flatly. Everyone in this gallery, everyone in this section of the station. The gravitational stress will propagate through the structure. We have maybe 90 seconds from full activation before hull integrity fails. And you're not listening because you think humans are too stupid to check your math. Administrator Vorsh stepped forward now, his expression hardening. Dr. Caldwell, you are becoming disruptive. I understand that your species tends toward emotional outbursts, but this is inappropriate. Either compose yourself or remove yourself from this gallery. Reyna looked around at the faces staring at her, some amused, some annoyed, some pitying. Not one looked concerned about her warning. Not one looked like they were taking her seriously. Fine. You're right, she said, her voice flat. I apologize. I'll let you conduct your demonstration in peace. She turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Zalvorath's voice, resuming his explanation, the moment already forgotten. Just another eccentric human causing a scene. How typical. How predictable. She didn't go far. Just outside the gallery entrance, there was a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the observation deck. It had a service window that gave a partial view of Chamber 1, and more importantly, it had a direct access terminal connected to the chamber's control systems. Emergency protocols allowed any researcher with proper credentials to access safety systems in case of accident. Reyna set down her case, opened it, and began connecting her device to the terminal. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from 3 months of preparation. The device interfaced smoothly with the station systems. She pulled up a secondary display showing the chamber's telemetry and the generator's status indicators. Inside the gallery, Zalvorath was wrapping up his speech. Thex was moving to the primary control console. The moment of triumph was at hand. Reyna watched the readings. Her heart was pounding. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she'd made some fundamental error in her analysis, and she was about to look like the galaxy's biggest idiot, standing out here in a maintenance corridor with an unauthorized device, while the greatest minds in the sector laughed at her paranoia. But the mathematics didn't lie. Mathematics didn't care about ego or credentials or species. It just was. Thex activated the generator. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The device in Chamber 1 began to glow, emitting radiation across frequencies that made the observation window shimmer with compensatory filters. The gravitational field began to build, exactly as designed. For 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, everything looked perfect. Reyna watched her secondary display. The field strength was climbing exponentially. The resonance harmonics were exactly where she'd predicted they'd be. The dampening fields were engaging, trying to compensate, using their flawed linear model against an exponential problem. 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The first alarm sounded. Confusion rippled through the gallery. That wasn't supposed to happen. Zalvorath's voice cut through, sharp with command, demanding a status report. 40 seconds. The field strength was entering the critical threshold. Localized gravitational fluctuations detected. Someone announced, their voice professional but edged with concern. Multiple microfractures forming in the chamber floor. 50 seconds. Reyna could see it through the service window now. The floor of Chamber 1, which was rated to withstand pressures that would turn a planet into a pancake, was developing visible cracks. They spread like a spiderweb from the base of the generator, each fracture releasing puffs of atmosphere into the chamber. 60 seconds. The generator was at 70% power. The gravitational field was beautiful in its own terrible way, warping space so severely that the light itself was bending, creating impossible colors and shapes that human eyes weren't designed to process. The mathematics Reyna had worked out predicted catastrophic cascade at 85% power. Shut it down. That was Administrator Vorsh, his voice cracking with panic. Emergency shutdown protocols, now. But the problem with gravitational fields was that they had momentum, quite literally. You couldn't just turn them off. They had to be ramped down carefully, managed, or the sudden cessation would create its own catastrophe. 70 seconds, 80% power. The cracks in the floor were widening. Structural alerts were screaming throughout the station. The generator was past the point of safe shutdown. They'd passed the threshold. The cascading harmonics were building, feeding on themselves, exactly as Reyna had predicted. The floor wasn't just cracking now. It was buckling. Pieces of reinforced hull plating, material that could withstand direct asteroid impacts, were curling upward like paper. The gravitational stress was propagating through the station's structure. In the gallery, people were screaming. 90 seconds. Reyna activated her device. The harmonizer came online with a whine that climbed through frequencies human ears could barely register. It interfaced with the generator's control systems, not overriding them but supplementing them, adding a correction factor to the dampening field calculations. It recalculated the field harmonics in real time, adjusting for the exponential propagation, compensating for the phase shift error that the original designers had missed. The effect wasn't instantaneous. Reality didn't work that way. But slowly, measurably, the cascading harmonics began to stabilize. The field strength stopped climbing. The gravitational fluctuations decreased in intensity. The floor stopped buckling. 110 seconds. The generator began its emergency shutdown sequence, but now it was controlled. The field collapsed in stages, each one managed and compensated for. The gravitational stress on the station's structure began to ease. 130 seconds. The generator powered down completely. The field dissipated. Chamber 1 was a disaster area, the floor torn apart, equipment destroyed, but the station was intact. The gallery was intact. Everyone was alive. Silence fell, broken only by the diminishing wail of emergency alarms and the harsh breathing of terrified researchers who had just glimpsed their own mortality. Reyna disconnected her device from the terminal. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding her system in a delayed reaction. She picked up her case, took a breath, and walked back into the Repinas gallery. Every eye turned to her. The crowd parted without being asked. She walked forward to where Zalvorath stood, all 8 of his limbs frozen in a posture of shock. "The field is stable," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Emergency shutdown is complete, no casualties." "You're welcome." The silence stretched. Administrator Vorsh found his voice first. "What? How did you?" "I've been trying to tell you for 3 months," Reyna said, and now the frustration was bleeding through, acid in her tone. 3 months. I sent reports. I requested meetings. I built simulations. I even constructed a working scale model on my personal fabricator. I warned you, specifically and repeatedly, that there was a phase shift error in the resonance dampening calculations that would create cascading gravitational harmonics. I explained exactly what would happen. I gave you the mathematics. I provided supporting data. And do you know what every single one of you did? She looked around the gallery, meeting eyes, watching them flinch away. You dismissed me. You laughed at me. You told me that human mathematics was too primitive to understand what the advanced species were doing. You patted me on the metaphorical head and told me to go back to my corner and let the real scientists work. She turned to Zalvorath specifically. You told me that the error was in my understanding, not your design. You said I was confused. You said my analytical tools were limited. You said my concerns were unfounded and that I should study Kefri tensor calculus for a few decades before I questioned your work. For the record, she continued, her voice dropping to something dangerous. I did study HFY tensor calculus. I learned it in 6 weeks. It's not that complicated if you actually pay attention. And the error was still there. It was always there. The mathematics don't lie, Dr. Zalvorath. They don't care about your credentials, or your species, or how many prizes you've won. 2 plus 2 equals 4 whether a HFY calculates it or a human does. She held up her device. This is a gravitational field harmonizer. I designed it 3 months ago after it became clear that nobody was going to listen to my warnings. It compensates for the specific type of cascading resonance error that I identified in your generator design. It's tuned to the exact frequency range and field strength parameters of your device. I tested it 3,000 times in simulation. It works. You built. Soriath started, her voice weak. I built a solution to your problem, Reyna said sharply. Because that's what you do when you identify a critical flaw. You fix it. You don't ignore it because the person pointing it out doesn't have the right pedigree or species. You don't dismiss concerns because they come from someone you've decided is inferior. You do the science, you check the math, and you listen when someone shows you evidence. Administrator Vorsh had recovered some of his composure. Dr. Caldwell, why didn't you push harder to make your concerns known? If you knew this was going to happen. Are you serious? Reyna's laugh was sharp and bitter. I tried. I have documentation of every attempt I made. I have saved copies of 17 reports I submitted. I have recordings of 3 meetings where I was dismissed. I have email chains where I was told, and I quote, that my enthusiasm was adorable but misplaced. I have a written reprimand from Dr. Zalvorath himself for wasting the department's time with unfounded concerns. She pointed at the destroyed chamber. What more could I have done? Set off the fire alarm? Send an anonymous bomb threat? Stand outside the gallery with a sign saying, "We're all going to die"? I used every proper channel. I followed every protocol. I did everything I was supposed to do. And every single time, I was ignored because the collective wisdom of this station decided that a human couldn't possibly understand mathematics as well as the elder races. Thex's wings were perfectly still, a sign of deep distress in Morgothi body language. The device you built. It shouldn't have been possible to design such a thing without access to the generator's full technical specifications. I reverse engineered them from the public portions of the project. Documentation, Reyna said. It took about 3 weeks. Again, not that complicated if you actually pay attention. The hard part was building the components on a meal fabricator that was never designed for precision engineering. Do you know how many tries it took me to print a coherent gravitational field emitter at 2 mm resolution? 47. I had to completely rewrite the fabricator's control algorithms. She turned back to Zalvorath. You're brilliant, all of you are brilliant. I'm not disputing that. Your work on quantum gravitational matrices is genuinely revolutionary. Soriath's field theory papers are some of the best I've ever read. Thex's artificial gravity framework is elegant and beautiful, but brilliance doesn't make you infallible, and credentials don't make you right. Everyone makes mistakes. The difference between a good scientist and a bad one isn't whether they make mistakes. It's whether they listen when someone points them out. The silence that followed was profound. Reyna looked around the gallery one more time, saw the mixture of shame, anger, shock, and, in a few faces, the beginning of respect. For what it's worth, she said quietly, your generator design is salvageable. The core concept is sound. You just need to revise the dampening calculations to account for exponential field propagation. I've already done the mathematics. They're in my latest report, the one that's currently sitting unread in someone's inbox. The corrected equations will work. You just have to actually read them this time. She headed for the exit. This time, nobody stopped her. 3 weeks later, Reyna sat in the primary conference room of Lab 7, at the head of the table that she used to watch from her corner workstation. The room was full of her former colleagues, though the dynamic had shifted considerably. Zalvorath sat to her right. He'd submitted a formal apology in writing, acknowledged his errors in judgment, and requested that she accept the position of lead researcher for theoretical gravitational applications. The station commander had approved it immediately. Zal Vorath was now her deputy, a role he was handling with surprising grace, all things considered. Soriath and Thex were present, along with a dozen other researchers from various species. They were reviewing the revised specifications for the Cascade Generator, now designated Cascade Generator Mark II. Reyna had led the redesign effort, incorporating her corrected calculations while preserving the elements of the original design that actually worked. The revised dampening fields are substantially more complex, Thex was saying, reviewing the holographic equations floating above the table. But the mathematics are sound. I've checked them personally. He paused, his wings fluttering slightly. Multiple times, very carefully. The simulation results are unanimous, Soriath added. Stable field generation across all power levels. No cascading harmonics. No structural stress beyond normal parameters. It should work? Should work. Reyna corrected gently. It will work. We've run 50,000 simulations. We've built 3 scale models, at different sizes. We've peer-reviewed the mathematics across 7 different species mathematical frameworks. I've even had human researchers back on Earth independently verify the calculations. It works. Administrator Vorsh, present via hologram from his administrative section, nodded his approval. The Galactic Collective has approved a second test, pending successful small-scale demonstrations. Dr. Caldwell, you'll be leading the project going forward. The Council has also, and I'm reading their official statement here, extended formal apologies for the institutional biases that nearly led to catastrophic loss of life, and has mandated comprehensive reviews of all major research projects to ensure that concerns from junior researchers or minority species are properly heard and evaluated. Translation. Reyna said dryly, "We nearly killed everyone because we were too arrogant to listen. So now we have to pretend we've learned something." A few nervous laughs rippled around the table. Vorsh's hologram smiled slightly. Translation. We nearly killed everyone because we were too arrogant to listen, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. But yes, essentially that. The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical details, timeline adjustments, resource allocations. When it finally concluded and people began to file out, Zal Vorath lingered. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, his voice quiet. "I wanted to speak with you privately, if you have a moment." Reyna gestured for him to continue. The room emptied until it was just the two of them. "I've been thinking a great deal," Zal Vorath said slowly, "about why I didn't listen to you. It would be easy to blame it on species bias, to say that I was influenced by cultural prejudices about humanity's relative youth in the galactic community. And that would be partially true, but it's not the whole truth." He arranged his limbs in a posture that Reyna had learned indicated contemplation. "The truth is that I was afraid you were right. I had invested 3 years of my life into this project. My reputation was built on it. The thought that I had made a fundamental error, that I had missed something so critical, was terrifying. So, I convinced myself that you were wrong. I found reasons to dismiss your concerns. I used your species, your credentials, your position as justifications for ignoring evidence I didn't want to see. That's called cognitive bias," Reyna said. "It's a known phenomenon. Very common, very human, ironically. Very universal, apparently," Zal Vorath corrected. "I wanted to apologize, properly, not just with official documents, but in person. You saved my life. You saved all our lives. And I treated you with contempt, because I was too proud to admit I might be wrong." Reyna was quiet for a moment. "You know what the worst part was? It wasn't the dismissiveness. It wasn't even the condescension. It was that all of you were so certain. You were so confident that you were right that you didn't even consider that you might be wrong. There was no doubt, no second-guessing, no voice in the back of your head saying maybe we should double-check this. That's what scared me more than anything. Not that you made a mistake, but that you made it with such absolute certainty." "Hubris," Zal Vorath said. "The ancient human concept. Pride before the fall. Every species has that concept," Reyna said. It's not uniquely human, we just have a lot of historical examples of it, because we're really good at falling. But the thing about falling is that sometimes you get back up, dust yourself off, and try not to make the same mistake twice. Will you? Zalvorath asked. Make that mistake twice, I mean. Now that you're in charge, now that people are listening to you, will you fall into the same trap I did? Become so certain of your own correctness that you stop listening to others? Reyna smiled. Ask me that again when someone points out a mistake in my work. But I'll tell you this. I'm making it standard protocol that any concerns raised by any team member, regardless of rank or species, get formally reviewed and documented. I'm instituting mandatory peer review from outside species perspectives. And I'm requiring that all senior researchers spend at least 1 day a month working in a junior position on someone else's project just to remember what it's like to not be in charge. That's surprisingly wise. It's surprisingly paranoid, Reyna corrected. I never want to be in that gallery again, watching people die because someone couldn't be bothered to check their math. So I'm building paranoia into the system. Institutional doubt. Required humility. Mandatory second opinions. Zalvorath made a sound that his species used for approval. The universe is vast, he said, and we are all small within it. Perhaps that is a lesson all species need to learn, again and again. Or, Reyna said, standing and gathering her datapads, perhaps we could just listen to each other the first time and save ourselves the near-death experiences. Novel concept, I know, but I'm optimistic. She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Dr. Zalvorath, your apology is accepted. And your work really is brilliant. The generated design was 99% perfect. You just needed someone to catch that last 1%. The most dangerous 1%, apparently. The most important 1%, Reyna agreed. The difference between success and catastrophe, between listening and assuming, between checking the math and trusting your reputation. She smiled. Between treating a colleague like an equal and treating them like a mascot. She left him there, contemplating that thought. 2 months later, the revised Cascade generator passed its first series of tests flawlessly. 6 months after that, it achieved full operational capacity without a single error. 1 year after the incident, the first successful Cascade-assisted faster-than-light jump was completed, opening up new regions of space for exploration and commerce. Dr. Reyna Caldwell received the Tannhauser Prize for Theoretical Physics, making her the first human to ever win the award. She gave a speech at the ceremony that lasted exactly 7 minutes and focused primarily on the importance of institutional systems for catching errors and the need for intellectual humility in scientific research. It was, by all accounts, incredibly boring, and also the most important speech anyone had given in decades. The Zenithar Research Station continued its work, now with revised protocols and a considerably more diverse leadership structure. Human researchers were no longer relegated to corners and coffee machines. Their concerns were heard, documented, and evaluated with the same seriousness as anyone else's. And somewhere in the station archives, carefully preserved, was Reyna's original report on the phase shift error, marked with 17 attempted reviews that went unread, a monument to hubris and a reminder that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one you're not listening to. The galaxy spun on, vast and indifferent, full of brilliant minds and terrible mistakes and the occasional triumph of someone being humble enough to admit they were wrong before everyone died. And in a small corner office that had been significantly upgraded from its previous accommodations, Dr. Reyna Caldwell worked on her next project,